Hello, and welcome to the Currency Exchange, NatWest Markets FX podcast, where we break down the themes and events that are shaping financial markets this week and in the weeks ahead. I'm Paul Robson. I'm NatWest Markets FX strategist for Europe, and I'm joined today for this week's podcast by Scott Livingstone, our resident expert on international relations. I think that will give you a little bit of a hint about what we're going to be talking about today, but it's clearly been a very important couple of weeks for international markets. Geopolitical concerns seem to be on the rise, so we're going to take a deeper dive into those events, and we're going to look into our crystal ball to look ahead to see whether we can identify other international events, geopolitical events over the coming months, quarters, and over the next year that could be influencing currency markets. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining us today. I know it was very short notice. You're clearly the man that's in demand, so we very much appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule to talk to us today. Maybe we can just start with this week's events in the Middle East. And I was just interested to hear your take on what we've observed this week.
Hi, Paul. And yeah, thank you. Very, very busy time. I'm actually in Eastern Europe at the moment, trying to focus on the Ukraine war and Russia. But you're right, the Middle East this week has grabbed everyone's attention. And frankly, Paul, I'm in a fairly anxious place. I think we are at the very edge of a scenario that virtually everyone has been trying to avoid since the atrocities of last October, and that is a regional war involving Iran, and we are at the edge of those decisions right now, and in the coming days. That's what we will see unfold, or potentially unfold some decisions that will shape that conflict. But we've never been closer to a war. Seeing a war in the Middle East involving Iran, and that's the situation at the moment.
And when we think about this week, was there anything that surprised you as a seasoned observer on geopolitical concerns and tensions?
So I think, Paul, that's a really good question, because things have shifted with a speed and a sense of surprise that most observers have experienced. And I was speaking to a Middle East expert this week, who I met at a conference with a deep knowledge of this situation, and their view is the same as mine. The thing that has been surprising, or one of the things that's been surprising, has been the fragility of Hezbollah in Lebanon. So events have moved fast in the last 2 weeks. We've seen significant and quite profound strikes against Hezbollah conducted, and most people watching the Middle East have always had a view that Lebanese Hezbollah is this incredibly powerful, well-equipped, cohesive, secure paramilitary organization with funded by and controlled from Iran, and facing off against Israel. And I think commentators are surprised by what we've seen as fragility in that organization. And I have to say, I think it's that reassessment is feeding into the decisions that are taking place right now in the Middle East. As I mentioned, they could move towards a war. So I think the biggest surprise for me has been the impact on Lebanese Hezbollah in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, and when we look ahead to how the situation will evolve, is there anything that we should be looking out for that would either point to some escalation or de-escalation, or something that would change the outlook, or your personal outlook for where we could be heading?
So I think we've seen an indicator already. We've seen Joe Biden last night say that very clearly, very publicly, and very directly say that he does not support an escalation by Israel attacking Iran's nuclear facilities. Now, that's a really powerful statement at a pivotal time, actually. Whether or not it changes decisions is yet to be seen. Actually, the Netanyahu government has demonstrated that it's more than capable of ignoring advice from Washington. But we will see. But that is definitely a clear signal of America's preference at the moment. I think we'll get another signal tomorrow. I think the supreme leader in Tehran is due to make a speech after Friday prayers. I suspect it will be a speech that will echo the message that came yesterday, which is that Iran has made its counter strike against Israel, and it brings an end to this escalation, this phase of escalation. I would be surprised if anything else happens unless the situation changes. So I think those are two things that one's happened, one's in the diary. And then I think events will signal intention. And despite what I've just said about the surprise of Lebanese Hezbollah's fragility, I think we can expect to see their capability being used and in an offensive way. It could be missiles, it could be rockets, it could be combat on the ground in Lebanon. And I think we will see Israel take a decision to respond to the Iranian ballistic missile attacks in some way. And there's Paul, there's two ways that could manifest. One is it can be a very calibrated strike, where the intention is made clear. The intention being to respond and to reset deterrence in the region. And then the other way is, as I've said, is a much more escalatory situation where Israel decides to deal with its persistent threat from Iran in a much more significant way, in a generational shift. So I think that's what we can see in terms of indicators. Then I'll be looking out for any announcements of American military configurations in the area, of naval vessels moving in, and I think we will be able to we will see shadows of messages that are given to the Americans coming out of Israel, and we just have to be very alive to it. But frankly, we're going to wake up to some news on this one, and I think it could happen quite surprisingly, Paul.
Definitely difficult times, isn't it, for the whole region? Interesting, you mentioned Joe Biden's comment about the nuclear facilities, trying to guide regional actors, I guess, about where the US's own red lines. They had seemed pushing very hard, and so with the sort of other Western countries trying to push for peace settlement. Feels like this week's events have sort of escalated a little bit quickly. Did you sense any other changes from the US administration's focus on the Middle East, having followed one path? To what extent are they willing and able to follow another path?
Well, listen, Paul, I've understood you right. I think the Americans are trying to be consistent, right? In terms of, first of all, their primary focus is supporting Israeli self-defense, and I don't think that will waver. I think in this case, and in my view, it seems easier for them to voice that position when the threat is coming from Iran than from when the threat is a more nebulous or difficult to attribute threat in terms of non-state actors. So this is a much clearer situation when ballistic missiles are landing from Iran. It's a far easier political statement to lean into supporting Israeli self-defense against ballistic missiles from another state. And so I think that is consistent. And I think there's a second consistency here, which we can interpret. I think it's a fairly sound interpretation, which is in the last month before a US election, then Joe Biden probably doesn't want to see an eruption of a regional war in the next 4 weeks as we close in on that election on the 5th of November. I think we can say that those 2 points will remain consistent in US thinking. But frankly, Paul, we're in a situation where events could build a momentum all of their own. And Joe Biden might not have a controlling hand on the direction or the speed of how things evolve in the Middle East.
Yeah, so that US election is looming. It seems to be coming around super quickly. It looks like it's going to be hugely important, I think, for a whole range of financial markets and regional tensions. Just one point about policy options from the US, and you mentioned those nuclear facilities, but also the oil facilities as well, at a time when the world is just over an inflation shock. And I think the last thing that policymakers want is a sharply higher oil price because of supply constraints. So maybe we can just delve a little bit more deeply into that US election. We obviously have two candidates that have sharply different views on geopolitical perceptions and where we're going. Feels like Harris is the continuity president, but I'd be interested to hear if that's the case, because she can clearly be her own person. But maybe just start with Donald Trump. If he was to be re-elected second-term president, how would you think that would change your thinking on the Middle East, but also a little bit more widely?
Well, Paul, it's really interesting. Behind. Well, first of all, we've got the presidents and the president's impact on foreign policy, but then we mustn't ignore Congress, and we mustn't ignore the incredibly this sort of flywheel momentum of the US foreign policy machine. And so the president, although the president does have significant powers, can only do so much. And I think there's my read of US foreign policy is actually between the two candidates and between the two parties, there are some important points of consistency and commonality, actually. So I'll give you an example. I've already said, defense of Israel. There really is no difference between the two parties on the US policy towards Israeli self-defense, and I think that will continue. I think it could be differences in emphasis, and there'll be certainly a difference in emphasis regarding the Palestine political solution and moving forward. But I think in terms of overall, I think that's a consistent view. And then I'd argue there's another consistent bipartisan view, which is the view of China, and that seems to have evolved from a competitor to an adversary, certainly in some spaces, some important spaces such as strategic technology. And I think that's a common shared view. And again, there'll be differences in emphasis and differences in techniques. We'll see possibly much higher tariffs being imposed by a Trump administration than a Harris, but fundamentally, the posture will be very, very similar. But there will be differences. And I think this is where I think, Paul, you're right. I think Harris is the continuity president when it comes to European security, for example. And I think there is a significant likelihood that President Trump would make quite a significant shift in US views on European security. They wouldn't abandon Europe altogether, but I think we would see a very strident message from Donald Trump to Europe to take a far greater responsibility for its own security. And I think we should listen to former President Trump when he talks about making a deal with or forcing a deal between Ukraine and Russia in the near future. And that will be a differential between the two presidents. And then taking a slightly bigger view, Paul, I think the biggest difference is between the two candidates is that President Trump would be far less inclined to pursue foreign policy objectives in a multilateral, in a coalition basis. I think we would see a much more unilateral approach to foreign policy problem solving by a Trump administration. Whereas I think President Harris would continue a decades-long posture of America projecting its global power in partnerships, in alliances and in coalitions. I think that could be a significant difference in approach between the two candidates.
Yeah, certainly when it comes to things that I'm interested in, which is the dollar, I think that there could be sharply different impacts on the dollar, and that will just echo, I think, into lots of financial assets and currency. So we're watching that outcome of that US election super closely from a currency point of view, and future podcasts will be looking at that in a little bit detail and just seeing how the polls shift. But it's clear that I think Donald Trump victory would be seen, at least initially, to be positive for the dollar, and maybe Harrison a little bit negative. Before we wrap up today, is there anything that we haven't covered that's on your mind? What keeps you up at night, which we haven't covered? It sounds like there's lots of things to keep us up at night.
I'm no shortage of things to keep me up at night. I think that we can't really have a geopolitical conversation and not talk China. It is the history-defining geopolitical issue in terms of the relationship that the West has with China and China's position in the world this century, and that is an evolving, another dynamic and multi-layered sort of set of relationships going on. And I think I just draw attention to two aspects. One is the foreign policy, which is in my particular focus at the moment, is the South China Sea, and we do see tensions there. And again, it's not just about Taiwan. There are significant tensions in this to the south of Taiwan and in around the Philippines, and that although it doesn't have, I'm not expecting a planned confrontation. It's got all the components of something that could accidentally escalate. So that's something really to just have in the back of one's mind as we look at the friction between China's foreign policy and the West, or its neighbours, in this case, the Philippines. And then the second thing, Paul, to do with China is to keep an eye on the domestic situation. I find it fascinating the stimulus sort of efforts that have gone in the last week. It seems that the Politburo has woken up to some of the economic downward trend, some of the looming economic problems. For example, 20% unemployment in the youth population, and 20% of China's 18 to 25-year-olds. That's a substantial number of people, and these are well-educated young Chinese men and women who are facing unemployment and the prospect of unemployment at a time when they're possibly also facing the prospect of not having the keys to a flat that will never be finished, an apartment that will never be finished in a city. So I think there is a significant issue that President Xi is facing in the domestic situation, and the question I'm constantly tussling with is whether or not those pressures influence the foreign policy. I have to say, so far, Paul, I'm not seeing it. I'm not seeing any linkage between domestic challenges, economic challenges, and Chinese foreign policy. But it may come, but I haven't seen it yet.
Yeah, that's all very interesting. It feels like we've sort of squared that circle a little bit. We started off with geopolitical concerns, and we've ended with China's stimulus you're mentioning there, which I think for global financial markets has been really interesting. I think there's been perhaps a little bit of denial about the escalation in geopolitical tensions over the last couple of weeks, but it's come at a time when you've had that, quite significant stimulus from China. I think a lot of people had given up hope about if and when that was going to come. That's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much again for taking the time to join us today. That's unfortunately all we have time for this week. So thank you everyone for listening to this Currency Exchange podcast, and hopefully you'll be joining us again in future weeks. Thank you.